This is the video for Chapter 16, Section 2, The Explorers. Before we move on with the section, you need to mark yourself on the scale. Also, read the score of 3, or the learning goal on the scale. I understand and can explain the significance of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the impacts it had on American history. This is the learning goal you need to be focusing on as you go through the section. After you complete it, go back and reassess yourself on the scale and mark where you are after you've covered the material. Here are a few things we need to keep in mind before moving on to the section. 1. The lesson essential question. What are the motives, hardships, and legacies of the group that moved west in the 1800s? So in this case, we're talking about the explorers like Lewis and Clark, John C. Fremont, and Zebulon Pike. So we're talking about those groups. What motivated them to go? What hardships did they go through, and what legacies did they leave behind? Also, these section essential questions. 1. What led to the Lewis and Clark expedition in the 1804? What was important to the survival of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition? And 3. What was one legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition? Remember, you need to copy these down and look for the answers as you go through the section. Another important thing we need to discuss is the vocabulary for this section. The 2 vocab words you need to know for this section are the Lewis and Clark expedition and legacy. The Lewis and Clark expedition is a journey that was made from 1804 to 1806 by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the territory gained in the Louisiana Purchase. And a legacy is a person or a group's impact on the future generations. So anything a person or group of people did that will then impact the generations of people after them living in that area. In May of 1804, the 45-member expedition left St. Louis, Missouri in 3 boats. Jefferson's private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and his friend, William Clark, led the expedition. Its members included soldiers, frontiersmen, and African-American slave named York, who worked for Clark. It was hard going from the first day. Rowing upstream against the Missouri River's strong current left the explorers' hands blistered and their muscles sore. Mosquitoes feasted on their sunburnt faces. By the summer, the explorers had reached the Indian country. Most American Indians welcomed the strangers, and York fascinated the Indians. They had never seen an African American before. Again and again, wrote Clark in his journal, York allowed his skin to be rubbed with wet fingers to prove that he was not a painted white man. The explorers made camp for the winter near Mandan Village in what is now North Dakota. There, a French fur trapper joined them along with his 16-year-old wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, and their infant son. As a girl, Sacagawea had been kidnapped from her people by another Indian group. Lewis and Clark hoped she would translate for them when they reached the Shoshone country. In the spring of 1805, the explorers set out once more. As they moved up the Missouri River, rapids and waterfalls slowed their progress. When they hauled their boats by land around these obstacles, the thorns of the prickly pear cactus pierced through their feet. Meanwhile, grizzly bears raided their camps, and the game became scarce. By late summer, the explorers could see the Rocky Mountains looming ahead. To cross the mountains before the first snows of winter closed the high passes, they would have to find horses, and soon. Fortunately, the expedition had reached the land of Sacagawea's childhood. One day, a group of Indians approached. To Sacagawea's great joy, they proved to be Shoshone. Learning that her brother was now a Shoshone chief, Sacagawea persuaded him to provide the explorers with the horses they desperately needed. The explorers made it over the Rockies, but they were more dead than alive. The Nez Perce, an Indian people living in the Pacific Northwest, saved them from starvation. A grateful Lewis wrote in his journal that the Nez Perce are the most hospitable, honest, and sincere people that we have ever met within our voyage. As winter closed in, the explorers reached their final destination, the Pacific Ocean. Clark marked the event by carving on the tree, William Clark, December 3rd, 1805, by land from the United States. Other explorers added to this legacy and helped prepare the way for the settlement of the West. In 1806, the same year that Lewis and Clark returned to St. Louis, the 26-year-old Army Lieutenant Zebulon Pike set out to explore the southern part of the new Louisiana Territory. Pike and his party traveled up the valley of the Arkansas River into present-day Colorado. There, Pike saw the mountain that today is called Pike's Peak. Pike went on to explore the Spanish territory along the Rio Grande and the Red River. His reports of the wealth of the Spanish towns brought many American traders to the southwest, but Pike was not impressed with the landscape. He called the West the Great American Desert. Another famed explorer, John C. Fremont, helped to correct this image. Nicknamed the Pathfinder, Fremont mapped much of the territory between the Mississippi River Valley and the Pacific Ocean in the 1840s. His glowing descriptions of the land of plenty inspired many families to try their luck in the West. Let's go over the section essential questions to make sure you fully understand everything you need to know for this section. 1. What led to the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804? Remember, the Louisiana Purchase had to have been bought before Lewis and Clark were sent to explore it. So the Louisiana Purchase is what led to Lewis and Clark being needed to explore the new land. 2. What was important to the survival of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition? This would be the Native Americans in the area, especially Sacagawea. And 3. What was one legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition? They mapped out a route to the Pacific. So, a legacy they're known for, to what helped future generations, was showing them a map and exactly how far it was from where they were at the Mississippi River all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, you need to go back and mark where you are on the scale. You need to complete the section essential questions. Complete all the notebook questions with complete sentences, and also the section vocabulary, in order to get full credit for the section. Once you've done that, you've completed section 2.